All right, so
All
we're
right.
here for part two to talk about the levels of inspiration today.
All right. Yeah, it's good to see you again, Aria. And I thought today, yes, we would put our two minds together and see if we can come to some new insights on this topic, right? Of the levels, different modes of inspiration and revelation in the Qur'an and in the Torah. I've been working on this for a while now. And I'm still processing some of the ideas, and I have not been able to come to adequate or quote unquote definitive formulation for some of these concepts. So maybe we'll make some headway today. Let's see. um, the
So
foundation
let's,
of sure.
yeah, let me
Go
just
ahead.
share the screen for the verses that we're going to be discussing.
Right. So this is looking at the fourth surah of the Quran, and ayat 163 and 164. At least that's the enumeration in the Hafs. Right? Slightly different enumeration sometimes in the Warsh, but let's look at this, and then we're going to compare it with a passage from the Torah. But so we surely have inspired, and this is A.J. Droge's translation, by the way. We surely have inspired you as we inspired Noah and the prophets after him, and as we inspired Abraham and Ishmael and Isaac and Jacob and the tribes, and Jesus and Job and Jonah and Aaron and Solomon, and we gave David the Psalms. And messengers we have already recounted to you before, and messengers we have not recounted to you. The you, of course, is the prophet of Islam. But God spoke to Moses directly. وَكَلَّمَ اللَّهُ مُوسَى تَكْلِيمًا. Now, this is based on what we were discussing yesterday. I would call this these two ayat a divine echo, a reworking of this passage here in the Torah, in the book of Numbers, chapter 12. The MT means the Masoretic text. And so, verse 6, and he, that's God, and he said, hear now my words. If there be a prophet among you, I, the Lord, do make myself known unto him in a vision. I do speak with him in a dream. My servant Moses is not so. He is trusted in all my house. With him do I speak mouth to mouth, even manifestly, and not in dark speeches. That means riddles or enigmas. And the similitude, or the likeness of the Lord, does he behold. I think it's especially intriguing if we look at the Targum, which I've listed there, where the Torah says in the Masoretic text that I speak with Moshe mouth to mouth. The way that the Targum renders that is speech with speech. I speak with him. Sometimes that's rendered word for word, but this term, Mila, in Aramaic, really, technically speaking, right, to be most accurate, it means speech. And that's actually also the case with the Arabic kalam. Right, so it's often translated word, at least sometimes in the Quran, when Jesus is said to be a kalam, Allah. That's usually rendered word of God, but it actually means speech, right? So it's not a single word, for instance. We could say, well, he's a word. It's not a single word, one word. It's a speech of God. All right, and so this is the way the Targum renders this particular divine statement. And it makes it even closer to the Arabic. Wa kalama Allah Musa taklima, right? So, but with Moses, right, God spoke with speech, that is directly. right? And so the Arabic there is actually quite close in structure to the Targum, right? With speech with speech, or word for word, right? I speak with Moses. Now, I think interested listeners are already going to be aware that in the Quran, the idea of revelation is usually expressed with various verbs and nouns, right? That basically referring to a descent or ascending down. Sometimes it's expressed causatively, right? So God causes something, causes revelation to be sent down. And now a lot of this research that I've carried out on this topic was also inspired by Khalil Andani's relatively recent PhD dissertation. It was an award-winning dissertation on the topic of kalam and wahi. So wahi is the noun, right, for inspiration. There in Ayah 161 of Surah 4, right, we surely have inspired. Well, it's a verbal form that's used there, but if we want to use the cognate noun, it would be wahi. So Andani dealt with wahi and kalam in the Quran in his dissertation. And the argument he built up was that in the Quran, the Torah and the other revelations, including the Quran, right, are called the kalam of God, not because they're verbally dictated by God word for word, but because they express in human speech the divine, transcendent, non-verbal revelation. So in other words, I mean, in common parlance, we would say that what he's arguing is that speech, divine speech in the Quran, the Torah, the gospel is a metaphor, right? For something that is ultimately beyond speech, right? And so this is a paradigm for a wordless or a non-verbal, I like to say pre-verbal, divine speech, right? That a prophet, quote unquote, translates or converts or shapes into linguistic speech, right? And so it pertains both to the wordless speech that's rendered into revelations, oral or textual revelations, right? Because as we say the Torah, right? We usually think of it as textual, but the Qur'an is oral, right? So these revelations that are intended for a nation or a people, right? So Andani writes about this nonverbal nature of wahi, inspiration, right? This is a quote: the Quranic concept of divine communication called wahi is a nonverbal spiritual inspiration as opposed to a verbatim oral dictation. It entails that Muhammad plays an active role in composing the Arabic Qur'ans, that's the different surahs, as a translation of this non-verbal inspiration. And I'll paraphrase here. Andani points out something that's well known in the literature. This term wahi in the Quran, if we look at how it's used outside of the Quran, let's say, in the early Arabic poetry, even some possibly pre-Quranic Arabic poetry, and thereafter, and the way it's used in the Quran, wahi is referring to some kind of cryptic, enigmatic communication that's usually indecipherable. It's used of animal communication as humans perceive it, right? We don't know what they're saying, or etchings in ancient ruins, right? That no one understands, right? And so they have to be deciphered. And so this concept of wahi, this is why Andani is stressing that when God inspires, right, with wahi, right, it's not that God is verbally dictating word for word some message, but it's some very cryptic inspiration that the prophet then has to, under inspiration, find the appropriate words, right, on the human earthly level to express them in order to be comprehensible by this culture. Do you have any concepts or anything to share on that point, Aria?
Yeah, one of the interesting things about the word kalam, a lot of times it's been used to talk about the esoteric meaning, the higher degrees of meaning In fact, if you recall, Adam, in his initial conversations with God or the Lord, he learns about the asma, the names. And then later, after his descent and after wandering for a number of days, then the kalam descends upon him. And so the kalam has always been a term that's used to refer to more direct or a higher level of meaning. And so I think this verse that we see here in the Quran, وَكَلَّمَ اللَّهُ مُوسَى تَكْلِيمًا, it is emphasizing that he received the most direct and most complete type of communication.
Right. That's a good point, because the argument I'll be developing, right, it does right. It's going to meet the resistance, I'm sure, of many readers of the Quran, because what I'm going to be arguing is that the Surah 4, right, and these two ayat 163, 164, that what it's saying, right, is that it is reserving a direct modality, right, of kalam for Moses and for Moses only, right? So this is something that no one else was ever privileged with. And so what we have to do then is to then be able to explain why then, for instance, in the example that you gave, why then do we have this word kalam, right, associated with Adam, for instance, right? And so we'll be getting into that later. But so before continuing on, let's just summarize these two verses again. In the Quran, what we have is, so God has surely inspired you, that's the Prophet of Islam, as we inspired, let's summarize it, the Jewish prophets or the Hebrew prophets, and Jesus, right? And messengers we have already recounted to you before, right? So that would include anyone else who has been named somewhere else in the Quran, and anyone else theoretically who is not mentioned in the Quran, right? But God spoke to Moses directly. So Moses, right, has received a modality of revelation that is superior to every other prophet or messenger. I mean, that's what this is stating on the face of it. And if we recognize it, as I at least believe it is, a divine echo of this passage from Numbers 12, right, we see that it's the same message that's being spoken there. And that is that God says in verse 6 in Numbers 12, right, that he speaks to all prophets in visions and dreams, except with Moses. With Moses, he speaks mouth to mouth. That's an idiom for direct communication. So he speaks directly with Moses. And so what that means is, according to the classical interpreters, like Rambam, Maimonides, for instance, is that God spoke with Moses while Moses was in a normal state of consciousness, right? So he wasn't asleep. He wasn't having visionary visions. So in other words, they're not an altered state of consciousness, but right in his normal everyday state of consciousness. And so he spoke directly and manifestly, not in enigmatic speech, right? Not in ambiguous speeches or parables. And the similitude, we'll talk about that later, the likeness of the Lord, he beholds, right? So he beholds it directly rather than in a dream or in a vision, right? And so what my argument is that this is the paradigm, the model to start with that both of these passages on the face of it, prima facie, right, are singling out Moses as utterly unique. He's the only one who has received direct revelation from God. And so what does it mean direct? Right, so God speaks directly. Maimonides explains that what this means is that the other prophets who receive revelations in visions and dreams receive them indirectly from God via an angel. So there's always this mediating angel, even if the other prophets don't mention an angel, right, when they're describing their revelations from God. The revelations are always mediated through an angel. And we're going to see that that's exactly also what the Qur'an says, for instance, of the Prophet of Islam. He did not receive revelation directly from God. He received it through an angel, through a ruh, a spirit, right? And so let's continue with this. Here, I want to speak about this intimacy between God and Moses. First of all, two more lines from the Targumim, that's the Aramaic translations of the Torah, in Exodus 33 in the Jonathan Targum, right? And the Lord spoke with Moses again, speech for speech, right? As a friend, it says. Then in Deuteronomy 34:10, again in the Targum, so that the word of the Lord knew him, to speak with him, speech for speech. Now, if we look at the Torah itself in those two verses, right, I have them there. And the Lord spoke to Moses face to face as a man speaks to his friend, Exodus 33:11. Now, again, face to face is a Hebrew idiom, which has the same meaning as what we read before there in Numbers 12:8. I speak with him mouth to mouth. Mouth to mouth and face to face mean the same thing in Hebrew. It's an idiom that means directly. God spoke to Moses face to face. That is directly. No intermediating angel and no altered state of consciousness, right? Normal state of consciousness, everyday waking state, as a man speaks to not only another person, but even to an intimate friend. And Deuteronomy 34:10, Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. So the Lord knew Moses directly. And that verb knew is very, very important, right? So the Lord knew Moshe face to face, because know in the Hebrew Bible often has this very, very intimate valence to it, right? It's even used for the intimate sexual union, right, between a man and a woman. For instance, Adam and Eve, right? We read in the Bereshit, in the Torah, that Adam knew Eve and she conceived and bore a son, right? So this knowing is an intimate knowing, right, of spiritual love. This mode of revelation to Moses, right, is that we see in Surah 4. It's described in even more intimate terms in Surah Maryam, in the 19th Surah, in ayat 51 and 52, right? And remember, or I would say celebrate, but anyway, and remember in the Kitab Moses. Surely he was devoted, and he was a messenger, a prophet. We called him from the right side of the mountain, and we brought him near in conversation. Now, that's I think really a weak translation because the Arabic is really referring to this very intimate mode of conversation between Moshe and God. And in fact, later in Islam, this becomes the inspiration for a literary genre called the munajat, right? These whispered communications, right, with God, where this genre we find compositions in this genre where the person speaking with God speaks on very, very intimate and friendly terms. Right, and so this is all based on this story, this note, a remark about Moses here in Ayah 52, right? And it's referring to the story of the burning bush. So I have these three instances here in the Quran. There are three instances or accounts in the Quran of was the incident or the episode of the burning bush, right? And this is told in Exodus chapter 3 and 4 in the Torah. And in Exodus 3, right, Moses speaks with God, and Moses says, well, you're going to have to tell me your name, because the children of Israel will want to know the name of a God that has sent me to them and is speaking with them. Right? And so God tells him, my name is Ehyeh, Asher Ehyeh. I will be what I will be. That's my name. And it's basically a substitute for the Tetragrammaton, the Yod He Vav He, right? The sacred name of God that traditional Jews don't pronounce. Instead, they say the letters Yud Ke Vav Ke, right, or Yod He Vav He, or substitute it with Adonai or Hashem, right? And but anyway, very interestingly, you will not see this in English translations of the Quran. But if you know your Arabic, you'll actually see that in these three accounts of the encounter of Musa and Allah at the burning bush, that this divine name in Hebrew is echoed, right? So I will be what I will be, right? Ehya, Esha Ehya. The first account is in Surah 20, verse 12, or Ayah 12. And if we read that literally, he's saying, indeed, I am your Lord. Right? And then the other account that has that same wording basically is in Surah 28, verse 30, or Ayah 30, where there the literal translation would be, indeed, I am, God, the Lord of the worlds. Right? And this repetition of I am, right, which is a way of emphasizing, the identity, is used by God only in these two verses in the Quran, nowhere else. Right? So it's not a common idiom. Right? Now there's a similar, right? There's a variation of this in the third account. Or it's actually the second, but the third one we're looking at, account of this statement at the burning bush in Surah 27, Ayah 9. There, the literal translation would be, indeed, He is, I am, the great wise God. Right? So one thing to recognize there is that the Quran, in each of these three accounts of the same incident, portrays God, or God says, this statement, and each time he varies the wording. So I think it's quite clear, right? This is a good example of what Andani is talking about, right? That the Quran is not claiming to be, it's not presenting itself as a word-for-word dictation from God, right? That gives this exact word. So the words here vary each time. The same incident is given, and yet God says something different, right? In each time, the same incident is retold. So the point here is to get the main idea across, and it's not a word for word dictation from God. The prophet, right, under inspiration, right, is finding words, right, to convey the main idea, right? And so the words are different for each telling of the identical same incident, right? There's some similarity, but there's also some really marked differences. One, he's God, Lord of the worlds. Right? The other, he's the great wise God. And the other, he's Rabbika, he's your Lord, right? Anyway, so before continuing, do you have any thing you'd like to say, or any questions at this point, Aria?
So in each of these examples, especially when we look at the burning bush, the burning bush obviously is a medium through which the absolute God is communicating with the servant Moses. And so I know in some esoteric texts, there's a lot of positions in terms of what this medium could have been. Because obviously no one can see or talk to the absolute God directly. And so what are some of your thoughts on what that medium could be? What could the burning bush actually be pointing towards?
Well, far be it from me to think I can, deliver a full answer, but I can give you my musings, which are going to be informed by my readings, right, in Jewish and Islamic sources. First of all, the point to make here, first point would be that we can understand this with reference to the later story of the Matan Torah, the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai. All right, so there's an account of that in the Torah, in the book of Exodus, and in the book of Deuteronomy, there's a retelling of it, a retrospective, speech of Moses, remembering all of the events at Sinai and the giving of the Torah. And this fire at the burning bush can be understood as an anticipation of the fire that appears on Mount Sinai. All the fires and the thunder and lightning and all that appear at Mount Sinai. So it's sort of an anticipation, right, of that. Right, so it's typical theophany language, right? When God appears in the Hebrew Bible, right, all of these symbols of fire and shaking, right, and thunder, these will appear, right? And so, right, if we say that no one can talk with God or see God directly, right? Yeah, so this is something that I think we'll begin to understand better once we get to the point of the Matan Torah. And so I'll probably delay it for now and just say that what we're seeing at the burning bush, right, is a symbolic anticipation of what's going to happen at Mount Sinai. In fact, right, at Mount Sinai, at the Matan Torah, there is a second revelation of the Tetragrammaton. Just as the Tetragrammaton is revealed at the burning bush, the Tetragrammaton is revealed again in a very special way at the Matan Torah. So it's almost as if the burning bush and the Mount Sinai Matan Torah story, giving the Torah story, are variants of a single story, even though they are separate, but they're almost two tellings of the same event, but they're just very similar events. They both involve a revelation of the divine name, attended by this symbol, theophanic symbol of fire, right?
Yeah, because in the Quran, when you just look at the text, you can see the degrees of revelation, and most of it is happening through an angel, and then you get to this point. I think there's this critical point when we're talking about the modality of revelation, and that is the story of the Isra and the Miraj, which which is described as a point where the Prophet Muhammad speaks to various prophets in his journey, but then he gets to a level where he's 2 bow lengths or less, as it's described in the Quran itself. And so that level of communication of being 2 bow lengths or less, what are some of the things that we can say about that?
Well, first of all, yeah, that's coming up next, because and here under the subsection I have modes of wahy and kalam, right? We're turning to the 42nd surah, right? And this is going to talk about kalam and then the modes of wahi, right? So what's sometimes difficult to work out, right, is the relationship between wahi and kalam. Now we already saw in Surah 4, ayat 163 and 164, that wahi is this indirect, right? Inspiration is this indirect revelation made to all prophets except Moses. And this direct revelation to Moses is described as kalam, which no one else receives. And now, keep in mind the chronology, at least the traditional chronology, right, of the surahs of the Quran. Surah 4, right, is a Medinan surah, and it's one of the latest. It's usually numbered as like the 92nd of the 114 surahs that were delivered, chronologically, the 92nd delivered by the Prophet. So it's a late statement. Now, the Surah 42 is much earlier, is usually considered to be the 62nd surah delivered by the Prophet, right? And so we have to read these earlier statements through the prism of the later statements, right? And that's going to be very important also for Surah 53, which you were referring to there about the two bow lengths, right? Surah 53 and Surah 42, which we're going to look at here, we all have to understand them through the prism of the much later proclamation in Surah 4, which makes it very clear that the Prophet of Islam did not receive a direct revelation from God, but it was channeled through an angel. And the vision that the Prophet of Islam has in Surah 53, right, is just that. It is a vision, right? So it's not a direct sight. It's being mediated. And traditionally, it's considered that the angel involved in that vision, right? That's enabling that vision to take place is Jibril or Gabriel. But in any case, Surah 53, again, is much earlier than Surah 4. And so Surah 4, right, must have Surah 42 and it must have Surah 53 in mind when it's pointing out that the Prophet has been inspired, right? But Moses has received this kalam, right? And he's, so let's look at this and see if we can work something out, because it's a challenging passage here in Surah 42. So we start, it is not fitting for any human being that God should speak to him. So here's the general concept or category of kalam or speech, right? And all right, so how does this kalam work? Well, it works through wahi, right? Or from behind a veil. Now, I would say that we shouldn't put too much emphasis on this this or, right, in Arabic. I don't believe that it means, all right, right, it's not fitting for any human being that God should speak to him except by inspiration or from behind a veil. So what I think that it means is that that from behind a veil, or that he should send a messenger, those are both modalities of wahi, right? At least that's my reading of this. If you look at the verse as a whole, it's not fitting for any human being that God should speak to him except through wahi, right? And the modes of this wahi are from behind a veil, or sending a messenger, which means an angel. And so this is sort of a Hebraism here, actually, because in Hebrew, the word malak for angel literally means messenger. The same is the case in Greek, by the way. So that he should send an angel, and he inspired by his permission. I think that's a weak translation. I think it should be his will, right? Inspired by the will of God, whatever he pleases. Surely is the Most High, the Wise, right? So in this way, we have inspired you, right? So the Prophet of Islam, with a spirit of our command. And that, I believe, the spirit of our command is usually, the spirit is usually understood as some type of angelic or super angelic entity. And I believe it's just building upon what we read in the previous ayah, that he should send a messenger, right? And he inspire, right? Through that messenger. So here we have inspired you with a spirit of our amr, of our command. And there the command is synonymous with what is rendered as permission by Droge in the 51st verse. So that's why I say permission should be something like behest or will. Permission is much too weak. So you did not know what the book was, nor what faithfulness was. That's how I would render it. But we made it a light by means of which we guide whomever we please of our servants. Surely you will guide people to a straight path. So it is not fitting for any human being that God should speak to him. Well, as I say, this is an early statement, relatively speaking, in the Qur'an. So it cannot contradict the later statement that says that, well, actually, there was one human being that God did speak through, did speak to, right? And not through Wahi, but through Kalam, and that is Moses. So it is not fitting for any human being that God should speak to him, but you have to understand there's one exception. And that's pointed out by a much later surah, Surah 4, Ayah 163 and 164. So there is one exception to all of this, and that's Musa. And these modes of inspiration, I should point out that in the Bavli, there's an echo of the Bavli here in the Tractate Hagiga, right? And it's folio 16a, right? And there we read that the angels hear from behind the curtain when God reveals some future events. What's that talking about? Right. So it's talking about this idea that of course, this is symbolic language, but in front of God's throne, there is a curtain, a veil. That's called a hijab, right, in the Quran, yeah, in Surah 42. And the side that faces God, all of cosmic history, everything that will ever happen is written there, right? And so what God does is he reads from that and gives that information to prophets. And that's how prophets can know the past or the future, right? And so it's from behind a veil, right? And this is what Hagiga is pointing out is that it's how does God, when God reads that information, that story, and he gives it to the prophets, he doesn't give it to them directly. He gives it through the angels. So the angels hear from behind the curtain what God reveals, right? And so what Surah 42, which is echoing this language, right? Right, God speaks by inspiration from behind the veil, right? So that's involving angels, right? So God doesn't speak through inspiration from behind the veil directly, right? Well, he speaks from behind the veil indirectly through inspiration, right? Through wahi, right? And so anyway, that's how I understand this ayah. Of course, as Muslims say, and God knows best, but the way I understand this ayah 51 is that it's saying that it's not fitting for any human being except Moses, right? When we read it, we interpret the Quran by the Quran. We interpret the earlier surahs by the later ones. It is not fitting for any human except Musa that God should speak to him, right? Except by inspiration, that is from behind the veil, or he should send a messenger, that is an angel, and that's how the inspiration, right, is delivered. So not direct speech from God, but through an angelic messenger. And then verse 52, we have inspired you with a spirit or an angel of our Amr. Right. So before going on, what are your thoughts about that? What do you think about my interpretation of those two verses?
Yeah, I think well, when you look at this verse, it's not fitting for any human being. So here we can maybe think about any being with a communicative capacity to interact with the divine. And then it seems to be going in degrees. Why from behind the veil? So each one is sort of like a little bit more. It starts from the most, I guess, direct to the least direct.
Yes, I agree.
And and obviously these are levels of communication, depending on how prepared one's vessel is to communicate with God. And then this final expression at the end in verse 51 that says, "Surely he is most high wise." I think it's pointing to a very specific characteristic of God, that he is in a very high position. And the word here, he is Aliyun Hakim, right? He is in this very high position, and Hakim meaning here that everything is in its proper position. And so this interaction that's happening between the created and the creator is definitely happening in levels. And so Moses is obviously having a communication that is in the highest level of this hierarchy.
Right. And so it's not fitting for any human being except Musa, right? That God should speak to him. That's the kalam. And then everyone else, it's by inspiration. And the highest form of the wahi is from behind the veil. And a lesser form of the wahi is through an angel that is sent. Right. And so we send a messenger or an angel, and he inspire. So the inspiration from behind the veil and the inspiration by sending an angel. Yeah, I think kalam is the highest. And then the highest level of the lower register of revelation is inspiration, wahi, right? Which is, and the highest form of that is from behind the veil, right? And then beyond that one is that God sends an angel, right?
And this reminds me of sort of there's a verse, I believe, that talks about how had we revealed this to the mountain would crumble.
Yeah, I'm going to get to that surely.
Yeah, so I think we're going to get to that. So I'm going to hold off on that issue.
And I would point out also that it is very important how this Ayah 51 ends, because this collocation, or these two divine epithets, they're really not, strictly speaking, they're not divine names, they're epithets. The Most High and the Wise, this occurs only one other place in the entire Quran. And that is actually in the very next surah. Surah 43, Ayah 4, where those two divine names are given to the Kitab, not to God, but to the Kitab. So the heavenly form, the heavenly matrix of revelation is said to be Most High and Wise. Right? So it's no coincidence, because it's just a few verses later, actually, because Ayah 51 and 52 and Surah 42, that's almost near the end of that surah, right? And so then you get the beginning of the next surah. Then it talks about the Kitab in verse 4, Ayah 4, and says that it is the Most High Wise, the identical, right? And that's given to the Kitab, the matrix of revelation. So it makes sense, because the matrix of revelation, right, that's where God's kalam and wahi originate, right? So that's where
I think it's important to distinguish Kitab from the Mus'haf, or the codex that's in our hands today.
Absolutely. Yeah, the Kitab is heavenly, and the Mus'haf is on earth. Right?
Yeah.
And the Kitab is pre-verbal, right? There's nothing written in it, except if we want to talk about quote unquote metaphor, figurative speech, or symbolically, but it's really pre-verbal, right? And that's why, at least according to the Quran, when a revelation descends to earth, right, from the heavenly Kitab, it can take on many different manifestations. It can be in Hebrew in the Torah. It can be in different languages for different holy books, right? And then it can be in Arabic. Of course, later it becomes a mushaf, but originally it's an oral Quran, a recitation. So it is very important, these two divine names in this sequence, Most High and Wise, is found nowhere except in these two ayat, nowhere else in the Quran. So there's a definite connection being made, right, between these two ayat, which almost occur together. And so it's pointing out that this kalam of God and this wahi of God, right, which all come from the same al-Kitab, the matrix of revelation, right? The different modalities that emanate from it, right? Yeah, so it's really important. So, all right, so some people might be wondering, right? So about my interpretation of Surah 4, where we started off, right? Surah 4, saying that only Moses, right, gets this kalam. Well, that's on the prima facie, right? That's what it's saying. I mean, it's giving wahi to everyone, even messengers and prophets that God has not named in the Quran. It says, right? It's assigning it to Moses. So so some people would think, well, doesn't that contradict what the Quran says elsewhere in many places, right? That we don't make a distinction between the prophets and the messengers, right? And that's Surah Baqarah, ayah 136, Surah Imran, ayah 84, both make that point, right? We make no distinctions between the messengers, right? However, that only apply, what the point being there is that all the messengers, right, have received a revelation in whatever modality from the same God. That's what that means. Because if we look at those, the same Surah Baqarah in later ayah 253, it does say that some messengers have a higher rank, a higher degree than others. God would give higher degrees to some messengers and prophets than he gives to others. That's also in the Surah Bani Israel, the 17th Surah. Also in ayah 55, right, makes the same point that God does give a higher degree, higher rank to some prophets and messengers than he gives to others, right? So when the Quran says that God doesn't make distinctions, and that the Muslims don't make distinctions between the prophets but accept them all, that does not mean that to deny that God has bestowed a higher rank on some, right? And lower ranks on others. And so all prophets have are from God. All messengers are from God. They get their message from the same God. So in that sense, you make no distinction between them. And yet God does make a certain type of distinction in the sense of the rank or the degree, right?
Yeah, and there's also there's the difference in rank. There's the difference in responsibility. So that's why Moses is considered part of the Ulul Azm, the ones with indeterminate, with great determination. Basically you have the covenant prophets, who came with greater responsibility. So the intensity of their communication and the modality of their communication is obviously different. Even if it's coming from, obviously it's all coming from the same source, but there's degrees of intensity and also degrees of application. Sometimes a revelation might be for a particular context. Other times the revelation is more global or more universal, right? So
differences in responsibility, as you say. For instance, Moses, right, receives a kitab in the sense of a law, right, for a certain sector of humanity, right, for the Israelites. And Muhammad, this also applies to Muhammad. Now, traditionally, Jesus and David are added to that list, right, that they received a kitab. But actually, I think, more recent research has really made a really good case showing that the kitab that Jesus and David received, well, especially let's just concentrate on Isa, on Jesus. The book that Jesus receives is not the Injil, actually. It is just the Torah that Moses right? It's the Torah of Moses. That's the kitab that God gives to Jesus. And so Jesus is there to bring hikmah, wisdom, right? So a correct interpretation of a book that's already been given. So Jesus doesn't get a book that it becomes the foundation, right? For his followers. And indeed, there is no writing of Jesus, right, in Christianity and the New Testament. Anything he said that was recorded was not, he didn't write it down, right? It was recorded secondhand, right, by various students, or what we call disciples, right? But be that as it may, yes, some messengers and prophets have a difference in responsibility, right? Some are given a body of laws, right, that must be followed, right? And another point, of course, Jesus gave no laws, right? So the church that's why the church has always had to create their own laws, canon law and different kinds of law, right, for rules for ritual and fasting and such as this. But be that as it may, all right. To get back to Surah Najm, this Surah 53, which relates this vision of the prophet. Again, as I mentioned before, right? Surah 53 is relatively early compared to Surah 4. Right, and so we have to read the earlier Surah 53 through the prism of the later Surah 4, right? And that revelation, that vision that the prophet is having in Surah 53 is being mediated through an angel, according to tradition, through Gabriel or Jabril. And not only that, keep in mind, it is a vision, right? So it's not, right? And so you go back to Numbers 12, right? That passage in the Torah where God says to all prophets, right, I'll give them revelation in dreams and visions, right? So in altered states of consciousness. But to Moses, right, I speak and I appear manifestly, not in a vision, not in a dream, but in his normal state of consciousness, right? And so, so we have to read Surah 53 right through the prism of Surah 4. I would say the same thing is the case with Surah 17, Bani Israel, right, which talks about the Isra, which I believe also right involved. That's the time also, I believe, the traditional accounts, at least is the time of the Miraj, right? So this heavenly ascent of the Prophet of Islam, which you described earlier, right? This also, right, is a vision, is a visionary ascent, right? And of course, there is traditional debate. Is it an ascent in the body, right, or just in the spirit? But in any case, it doesn't matter, right? Because the spirit or the mind, right, right, is always associated with the person and with the body. I don't want to get into the philosophy of all of this and different theories of psychology, right? But in any case, I think that traditionally considered, the choice between was it in the spirit or in the body, I think that's too narrow of a binary, right? Because the spirit, traditionally considered, is beyond, right, the mind and the body, the human mind and the human body. The human mind and human body is a binary which emerges from a state, right, that is more unitary, and that state is usually called something like the spirit, right? So so was the Isra physical or in the mind of the prophet, right? No, that's too limiting, I think. But be that as it may, it's a visionary ascent, and we have a lot of parallels to this, right? In especially in Jewish texts from the Second Temple period, right? Usually called the Merkava ascent, right? It very similar.
This experience of Isra Miraj seems very critical towards revealing a different mode of revelation. And what's interesting is that the details of this journey, this experience, are not really elaborated in the Quranic codex that we have in our hands. And I think this is very important because it actually, to me, reveals, or, for lack of a better term, it shows a different degree of experience and revelation. And there's obviously some variation in terms of what the prophet experienced in this, but it definitely was very consequential. But its details are not in the codex that we have in our hands today.
Yes, you'd have to know quite a bit to be able to read it between the lines, so to speak. And someone who's done a good job of that recently was Angelika Neuwirth. She's published a chapter in a book, anthology of different scholars, on Surah Bani Israel, on the 17th Surah, right? And she points out, and other scholars also have recently written on that surah. They've pointed out that actually later in the 17th surah, right? Well, first you have the Isra, which I believe implicitly is also implying the Mirage, right?
Yes.
And just about 20 ayat or so later, you have the Quran's divine echo of the 10 Commandments, right, which were given at the Matan Torah, right? So it's as if this ascent is implying that the Prophet of Islam, right, received a new Torah, for let's call it the Quran, right, a new Torah. So a reworking or a divine echo of the 10 Commandments, which were given at Mount Sinai, right? And then later, where salat or prayer is spoken of, it's like in somewhere around ayah 70 to 80 or somewhere around there. There is actually a hint at the ascent of the Prophet of Islam, right? And it's couched in terms of an echo of the Jerusalem Talmud's account of the 4 rabbis who entered Pardes, who ascended into paradise. It's very fascinating. But so the difference is this, which we're about to get to now, and that is all right. So you have this this uniqueness of Moses in Surah 4, ayat 163 and 164, right? And it's an echo of that passage from Numbers chapter 12. Right, so there's a uniqueness of the way that God communicates or speaks to Moses. And now we will see that there is a uniqueness in the modality of the revelation of the Torah at Mount Sinai, which is a different modality of revelation from all other revelations. Right? And the difference is that Mount Sinai, at least according to the Torah, right, at Mount Sinai, this revelation is given directly by God, right, to Moses. So that's in agreement with Numbers chapter 12. But the story told in Exodus, right, is that God reveals the Decalogue, the 10 Commandments, publicly, directly to Moses and to the entire nation of Israel. So the entire nation of Israel witnessed this public revelation of God, right? And admittedly, this is mind-bending, right? And it's difficult for the human mind to process. But in any case, without necessarily explaining it or having to understand, the realities behind it, if anyone can, but the difference in the modality of revelation with the Torah and other revelations is that the Torah was revealed by God publicly. It was revealed by God directly to Moses and to the entire nation of Israel. So the account in Exodus is that God delivers the 10 Commandments, speaks them directly to Moses and all of Israel. And while God is delivering the 10 Commandments, the nation of Israel then intercede or beg Moses, look, don't have God I'm going to paraphrase, have God stop talking to us directly. We can't handle it. You let him continue speaking to you, and you can tell us what God says. Right now, the rabbinic literature, you know, the Talmud and sources like Pesach Rabati, the rabbinic literature, including in the Talmud, right, which is a source that God echoes in the Qur'an. We saw, you know, yesterday. The rabbinic tradition of the Talmud tells us that at Sinai, when God spoke, it was so overwhelming that the entire nation of Israel died. Their souls left their body. They died. And then God resurrected them, right, from the dead, right? I think this is, you know, it's very controversial, but it's in the tradition, and I think it's actually hinted at in the Quran. Although maybe not everyone is going to be convinced, you know, by my interpretation, but we'll take a look at it. Well, first of all, let's go through the Torah really quickly, right? So I just told you, like in Exodus 19 and 20, God descends, right? So God descends on Mount Sinai and directly conveys the Ten Commandments. Now, the account in the Quran, God doesn't descend directly, right? But God causes the Torah to descend. So there's, you know, that difference to be taken into account. But the story in the Torah is that God gave the two tablets of the Ten Commandments to Moshe. Then he saw the people worshiping the golden calf, and Moshe broke those tablets. And God told Moshe, all right, prepare, right? I'm going to give you, you know, for a second set of those tablets. So basically a second Matan Torah after the sin of the golden calf. Now, so after Moses has broken that first set of tablets, this famous passage in Exodus 33 happens, and we're going to read the echoes of it in the Quran. But there at the bottom of page 3, I have it: the vision of God's face and back. That's the topic, right? So Moses prays, now therefore I pray thee, if I have found grace in thy sight, show me thy ways that I may know thee. Now in the Septuagint and in the Quran, it has Moses just saying, show me your sight, show me yourself. Right. Then you skip down to verse 7. And the Lord said to Moses, all right, I'll do this thing that you've asked. And so then in verse 18, Moses says to God, show me, I pray you, your glory. And God said, I will make all my goodness pass before you. Right. So this glory and the goodness, it's the same thing. Right. They're synonyms. Right. And will proclaim the name of the Lord before you, in front of you. So God is going to come to Moses, stand in front of Moses, and God will proclaim or invoke his own name. It's astounding. Right? And I will be gracious to whom I will be gracious. I will show mercy unto whom I will show mercy. That's an echo of the burning bush episode of the divine name. I will be what I will be. I will be merciful and gracious to whom I will be merciful and gracious. Right. And then, but God said, right, in verse 20, and God said, you cannot see my face. Right. For a mortal shall not see me and live. Now, notice he doesn't say that it's impossible to see God. He says it's impossible to see God and live. Right. And the Lord said, behold, there is a place by me, and you will stand upon the rock. Right. And it will come to pass when my glory passes by you, that I will put you in a cleft of the rock and will cover you with my hand until I have passed by, and I will take away my hand and you will see my back. Right. But my face you will not, but my face shall not be seen. Right. Right. And so the account continues in the next chapter. Right. So this is verses 1 And 2 and 3, God tells Moses, get 2 tables of stone. I'm going to inscribe them, right? And so he goes up to the Mount Sinai again, and verse 4, and then verse 5, and the Lord descended, that's on the Mount Sinai where Moses was, and stood with Moses there and proclaimed the name of the Lord, right? Just like he said he would. And the Lord passed by before him and proclaimed, right? The Lord, God merciful and gracious, etc. Right? So there we have Yikara Yode Bave El, right? Which Rachum Vachanun. So which is right echoed in the Basmala. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. So where the Bismillah, right, is coming from, is a divine echo. If you look back at chapter 33, verse 19, where God says, I will proclaim the name of the Lord. Yikreti b'shem yod-he vav-he. And the bet preposition b'shem in b'shem yod-he vav-he is what we call the bet essentiae. So it is superfluous. Is in Arabic it would be the ba zaida, the superfluous ba. So you don't translate it. So now, and that's what happens in Surah 96, right? Incidentally, right, where it says ikra, right, bism rabbika. So that's not you. That does not mean proclaim in the name of your Lord. That's a ba zaida. It means proclaim the name of your Lord. And it's an echo right there of Exodus 33, verse 19. But in any case, in any case, all right, so Moses sees the back of God. Incidentally, the Bavli, the Babylonian Talmud in Baruch 7a and Manoch 35b, it explains, of course, this is symbolic language, of course, but it explains that the back of God that Moses saw was the back of God's head, and it's the knot of the tefillin, of God's tefillin. It's because God prays in the Talmud, just like God prays in the Qur'an. But in any case, right, so it's referring to the Shema Israel. When Jews pray the Shema Israel, right, put on the phylactery, the tefillin, and the phylactery, the little box right on the head, right, has a scroll inside of it with Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad written on it, right? Deuteronomy 6:4, etc. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. So that's what's said. Now, what the Bavli tells us is that just as human beings, Israelites, right, pray the Shema and proclaim when they have the tefillin on, and proclaim the divine oneness, the divine unity, God wears his tefillin and he declares the unity of Israel, the oneness of Israel, right? So God is one, Israel is one. This is a very important rabbinic trope, right? The unity of God and Israel. And in fact, there's a later saying that God, Israel, and the Torah, these three are one, right? So there's like a mystical union between these. Also, Sufis would say that there's a similar idea in the Qur'an, right? Right. In any case, right. So now, right. So this is the second Matan Torah, right? So at the first, here we have the Matan Torah at the bottom of page 4. Now we'll go to a Quranic echo. It's Surah 7, Ayah 143. This is an echo, right? Of Exodus, the book of Exodus, right? So, and when Moses came to our meeting and his Lord spoke to him, he said, now some people think this meeting was the meeting at the burning bush, but it's not. This is talking about Mount Sinai, same mountain, but the Matan Torah, the giving of the Torah. And his Lord spoke to him. He said, my Lord, show me yourself. Right? So that's what we read in Exodus 33. Lord, my Lord, show me yourself, so that I may look at you. God said, you will not see me, right? Again, we read that. God said, you'll not see my face. You will see my back, right? Anyway, you will not see me. Now see, the people who originally heard the Qur'an, they knew these, the background in the Torah. So they would know the story that God told Moses, well, yeah, you're not going to see my face, but you will see my back, right? So we could read that in here. God said, you will not see me, but as you'll not see my face, you'll see my back. You'll not see my face. No one sees my face, right? Now look at the mountain. If it remains in its place, you will see me. But when the Lord revealed his splendor, Tajala, right, to the mountain, he shattered it. Moses fell down, thunderstruck. And when he recovered, he said, glory to you, I turn to you. In repentance, I am the first of the believers. Now, this terminology there is really interesting. What is Moses fell down, thunderstruck, sa'ikan, right? Elsewhere in the Quran, that always involves death, right? Like in Surah 39, 68, right? It describes falling down dead. And elsewhere, it's talking about death-dealing thunderbolts, like Surah 2, Ayah 19, Surah 4, Surah 41, Ayah 13 and 17, Surah 51, Ayah 44, look them all up, you'll see this. And then in Surah 2, right, remember when you said, Moses, we shall not believe you until we see God openly, and the thunderbolt took you while you were looking on. Then we raised you up after your death so that you might be thankful, right? So that's an echo of the Talmudic and Midrashic stories that Israel died at the Matan Torah because of the direct appearance of God, right? And so that's what it means in Ayah 55 when it says, until we see God openly, right? Same thing that Moses saw God manifestly, right? In Numbers chapter 12. And so the implication actually is here in the Quran, I believe, it's very subtle, right? That actually they did see God openly, right? And they died from it. And of course, according to the Quran and the rabbinic tradition, then God resurrected Israel. Now, when Moses fell down thunderstruck, or Moses fell down dead, that to me seems to be an echo of the Torah, where in Exodus 34, right, after the second Matan Torah, it says that Moses hastened and fell to the ground, worshiping God, right? So I believe that's what this is talking about. In any case, this in Deuteronomy, this event, right, is described this way, chapter 5. The Lord spoke with you, that's with Israel, face to face, that is directly. So it doesn't mean that they necessarily saw God's face, right? But it means a direct communication. Somehow, mysteriously, God was present, directly present, not indirectly, not through an angel, not through a vision, not in an altered state of consciousness. The Lord spoke with you face to face, and this is the middle of page 5, in the mount, out of the midst of the fire, right? A couple of verses down, and the Lord spoke unto you out of the midst of the fire. You heard the voice of words, but you saw no form, only a voice. So apparently, I think only Moshe saw the form, the temunah. That's the same word used in Numbers chapter 12, where it says God that Moses sees the manifestly, not in a vision, but manifestly, in a normal state of consciousness, sees the likeness, the temunah of the Lord. But everyone else, they only heard the voice, direct voice of God. Take ye therefore good heed unto yourselves, for ye saw no manner of form, temunah, on the day that the Lord spoke unto you on Horeb, that's Sinai, out of the midst of the fire. The Lord spoke with you face to face in the mount, right? Again, face to face, directly, right? So it's just a Hebrew idiom, face to face or mouth to mouth, direct communication. Doesn't necessarily mean that they saw, right, the divine face. No man will see the face. On the other hand, right, the rabbinic tradition very strongly implies sometimes that it really does look like God says, no man will see my face and live. Well, if Moses, and the nation of Israel died during the Matan Torah, what's the implication? I think, some rabbinic traditions sort of imply that, yeah, that somehow whatever the face of God means, that they must have seen it. Now, this point about the mountain in Surah 7, verse 143. So when the Lord revealed his splendor to the mountain, he shattered it. Right. So now keep in mind, elsewhere in the Quran, very often the earth, the sky, the trees, the animals, the mountains, they are personified. Right. They praise God, they glorify God. So they're thought of as personified entities. Right. So why does the mountain shatter? Because the mountain is a personified entity and it saw God and it died. Right. Just like Moses and the nation of Israel. Right. Anyway, I'll stop at that point to see if you have anything to add. We're nearing the end, but do you have anything you want to interject here, Aria?
Yeah, this is I mean, this whole experience here, especially the notion of a collective revelation, I think is very important to emphasize, because when you have a public revelation like this, then there's a way for public scrutiny, there's a way for public verification, and also ultimately accountability. And so I think this difference, where the mode of revelation goes from a one-to-one modality to a collective modality, I think is something important. And I think you might see some echoes of this in the story of Christianity and in the story of Islam, but it's not to the same degree of detail and metaphysical consequence
Right.
that we see here. And ultimately, right. I think you're getting a sense of this divine communication becoming more and more intense as the servant or the traveler gets closer and closer to this divine origin.
Right. Yeah, and that what you've just said is congruent with the fact that, right, both Christianity and Islam accept the truth, accept the reality, right, of the revelation at Sinai, whereas the revelations of Christianity and Islam are debated, right, by Judaism, by other sectors of humanity, right, because the modality of revelation in Christianity and Islam was not the same. It was not public, and the Quran acknowledges that, right? And so that's why there is debate. Well, was the prophet of Islam a true prophet? Was Jesus really the Messiah? These things can be debated because they involve what could be called private revelation, right? Private mean in the sense of to one person, or to, a group, whether that's a small or even a relatively large group. It's still not an entire people, an entire nation. And that's here at the bottom of page 5 here in the 4th surah, to go back to there where we started, right? Besides Ayah 164, right? The only other verse there that mentions Musa or Moses is Ayah 153. Right? And let's read it. The people of the book ask you to bring down on them a book from the sky. They had already asked Moses for something greater than that, for they said, show us God openly. So the thunderbolt took them for their evil doing. Then they took the calf after the clear signs or miracles had come to them, but we pardoned them for that, and we gave Moses clear authority. But notice, the people of the book are asking the prophet of Islam to bring down on them a book from the sky. That's an allusion to God coming down with the Torah, sending down the Torah, right, at Mount Sinai, right? And so they point, right, that the Quran then makes, right, in Surah 59, verse 21, which is an echo of Exodus 19:18, right, is this on the last page. If we had sent down this Quran on a mountain, you would have indeed seen it humbled and split apart out of the fear of God. Right, so that's referring to this, to what we already read. Right, so God gave the vision of God to the mountain and shattered it. Right, now what this ayah is saying, if we had sent down this Qur'an on a mountain, you would have indeed seen it humbled and split apart out of the fear of God. So what the implication, right, of if we had, is that, right, although the Prophet of Islam's message was divine in origin, right, as was Moses, the mode of the Prophet's revelation was nevertheless different, right? It was a lower modality from what Moses received, right? And so the message is that God could have made the Islamic revelation a public national revelation, right, with direct divine speech like Moses' revelation, but God didn't choose to do that. Instead, God delivered the Islamic revelation in a private, individual mode through angelic mediation to the Prophet, right? And I think one of the reasons, from the Quran for that would be probably that, well, right, look what happened to Israel. Israel received this public revelation, and then they turn right around and start worshiping the golden calf, right? So, one could say, so if the Prophet could bring down, right, a book out of the sky in a nationally public revelation, what would the result be, right? It could be that again, right, immediate apostasy, right?
Right.
And so, but this doesn't take away from the importance of the fact that the revelation of Sinai was public, because there's an important reason for that, according to rabbinic tradition. And that is, right, it ultimately doesn't matter too much, right, that Israel then immediately fell into the sin of the golden calf. At least it doesn't matter too much for the understanding of the importance of why it was a public revelation. It's because, and it is related to the sin of the golden calf, because it's making a point. That whole story of the golden calf is making this point. It's that God revealed the Torah publicly and nationally, and part of that revelation was that Torah is for all time. As long as there's a sun and moon in the sky, Israel must be faithful to that Torah. So the whole nation understood that directly from God. And so for as long as this world endures, Israel cannot abandon the Torah. They cannot abandon that covenant, right? And so when sins are committed, right, there is no doubt as to how to rectify it, and that is to return to that Torah, right? The knowledge of whose divine origin is certain, right? So anyway, that's probably about all I have to say there. As I said, some of my thoughts are, I'm still struggling, right, with some of the, exactly, how do we relate kalam and the different modes of wahi? Because there are 5 ayat in the Quran where God does speak to Musa, right, through wahi, but none of those are at Mount Sinai. Right, one of them is when he split the Red Sea, and instances like that. Right, so the lower modality, right, of revelation, right, is received even by Moses upon occasion, right, but in general he's receiving this highest mode, right, especially when it comes to the necessity of delivering a message for the entire nation. Right, it has to come through that highest modality of kalam. Right.
And it seems like, especially in the case of the 3 Abrahamic religions, that this mode is to be completed in a messianic figure, whether it's the Mashiach in Judaism, the second coming of Jesus in Christianity, or the return of the Mahdi in Islam. It seems like we are headed towards a public revelation, a public covenant that would unify basically the carriers of the covenant and the believers as a whole.
All three religions think that way. Yes, yes.
So,
yeah, there are traditions in all three, right, that point that in that direction. Yes.
And yeah, I mean, it seems like the books that we have are definitely not the complete book, and there will be more of that completion that happens in the Messianic age. And people's consciousness and understanding and maturity will have reached a level so that they wouldn't make the mistake of the golden calf. Because the golden calf also, at least according to what the Quran was saying, is that it was based on the dust of the feet of the angels. So there was some revelatory truth in it, yes, that had certain sustaining power, and obviously the calf represents a lack of readiness for Israel to fully embrace the message of Moses that he received in Sinai, and you can see sort of this lack of readiness from the disciples and the followers, both in the Christian tradition and also in the Islamic tradition, and until humanity sort of reaches that Mosaic level, builds its capacity to that level to be able to receive and be able to see God in a literal sense. I mean, not in an anthropomorphic sense, obviously, but in a very intense, direct relationship with the divine. So I think this.
Go ahead, please.
No, I think this subject is so important in the sense of understanding revelation in degrees, as opposed to a zero sum or black and white kind of way. And I think that's one of the most important aspects of this conversation.
Yeah, well, with respect to, let's say, go back to Moshe, it says that he sees manifestly the likeness or the form of the Lord. Right now, according to some Kabbalists, right, this we can interpret that different ways. Right, there's the way of Maimonides, right, who's a lot of Islamic influence, right, in his philosophy, even though he's probably the greatest Jewish philosopher. He would say, well, this is metaphorical, right? It's metaphorical seeing, like a divine illumination from the mind of God to the mind of Moshe, right? Metaphorical. Now, Kabbalists, though, I think have a more profound approach. And that is, well, when we talk about, the body of God, and whether or not Muslims, like to hear it, you have that in the Quran. You do. We have the hand of God mentioned, the feet, right? So there are these anthropomorphic images. But the Kabbalists would say, the analogs of those in the Torah, how do we understand them? They are neither metaphorical nor literal. And in fact, we do not know. The mystery of what it actually is too profound for the human mind, right, to crack, right, and to understand. So it is neither, it belittles it to say that it's just figurative, it's just a metaphor, it's just a symbol, right? It's neither literal nor figurative or metaphorical. It's something much more profound, and that's where humility comes into play. We have to be humble that there are some things we just cannot answer. We just can't understand it, and I think that's also implied in the Quran. And but in any case, so another way of looking at it is that the Kabbalists would say the body of God, this form of God that Moshe saw manifestly, is not a physical body, right? But a body composed of the letters of the divine alphabet. Is a textual body, which is a really mind-boggling, profound insight, right? But according to Judaism and many Islamic mystics, right, God spoke this universe into being by combining the divine letters, right, in different ways, right, and that's how we get things. Now, according to the Kabbalists, God created the heavens and the earth in 6 days. They rested on the seventh day, but somehow the order of creation was not actually finished until Mount Sinai, and then the tabernacle was set up, right? And that's another conversation. But the order of the letters in the Torah were actually different, right? And then when the creation, up until the time creation was completed at Sinai, and then the building of the mobile tabernacle. Right? And the importance of the mobile tabernacle is it had a holy of holies with the Ark of the Covenant, which the Qur'an mentions, actually, the Ark, right? But anyway, and that's in that holy of holies, that's where God and Moshe had this direct speech, right? So it was in that context, but it's a very deep mystery. But in any case, to finish this up, the body of God is neither literal, physical, nor just metaphorical. It's something quite more profound than that, which human beings would be arrogant to claim that they really understand it.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think it's important to we tend to oscillate between the two binaries of literal or metaphorical. And I think that third option that you just laid out is a good way to think about this whole conversation, is that there's God cannot be boxed in. And he's beyond even all the names that we ascribe to him. And so I think that's a very, very powerful point.
I wanted to follow up on a few points on our previous conversation, just for the sake of truth, for the sake of dialogue. I just wanted to make things a bit clearer, right, on a few points that may have been misunderstood by some viewers. The first point I wanted to make is, right, we were talking about the fourth surah, and ayat 163, 164, that points out that God inspired, or he granted wahi, inspiration, to the Prophet of Islam, to all the Hebrew prophets, and to Jesus. But to Moses, he spoke directly. Right? So he spoke in taklima, right, in conversation. And so my argument is that the Quran is privileging Moses as a unique prophet who has received a revelation through the highest modality of revelation. So not necessarily through this lower form known as wahi, but through speech, but intimate speech, taklima. And so I just wanted to make this brief point, right, that to emphasize this Quranic point, right, which gives this uniqueness and indeed a superlative mode of revelation to Moses, is not to minimize or especially not to deny the many unique features or aspects of the Prophet of Islam and of the other prophets, such as that were listed there, Jesus and the other Hebrew prophets. It's only to observe that taklima, right, with God, is not one of the Prophet of Islam's unique aspects, and it's not one of the unique aspects of Jesus or any of the other Hebrew prophets, according to that Quranic passage, right? And also, last week, I made the point, we discussed this point, that there is a corollary, right, between Moses receiving this intimate dialogue and conversation, enjoying this intimate conversation with God. And the corollary of that is that the Torah, the revelation that Moses was given was also unique, as a unique mode of revelation. That is, that it is a public revelation with a national scope. The entire nation of Israel witnessed the giving of the Torah. And this is why Christianity and Islam recognize the divine origins of the Torah. And in contrast to that, the revelations of Islam and Christianity are private revelations. They were made to an individual or to very small groups of people, not to entire nations. And this is why among the Abrahamic religions, there is enduring debate about the validity, right, of the truth of the revelations of Christianity and Islam. Right? So whereas everyone acknowledges the truth of the Torah, there is debate about the truth of the New Testament and the truth of the Qur'an. Now, so I don't want that point to be misunderstood either. In fact, but the New Testament and the Qur'an, they both assert that this is just the plan of God, right? And we can see this, I have listed here Surah 5, verse 48. For each of you, we have made a pathway and an open road. If God had so pleased, he would indeed made you one community, but he did not do so in order to test you by what he has given you. That's the revelation, right? So race toward doing good deeds to God as you return, all of you, and then he will inform you about your differences, right? And so the New Testament has a similar idea, right? So it could have been, right, that God could have chosen that the revelations of Jesus and the revelations of revelation of Islam would have been national in scope, and the whole world would have recognized it, right? And there would have been no more debate, right? And they would have everyone would have accepted the truth of Christianity and Islam, just as everyone in the Abrahamic religions accepts the truth of the Torah. But according to the New Testament and the Quran, this was simply not God's plan. God's plan was that there be this enduring debate, but that what one is to do is to defer judgment on in this in the disagreements between the religions until the day of judgment, when God, right, will settle these issues, right? And quoted Paul in 1 Corinthians 4:5, therefore do not pronounce judgment before the time, before the Lord comes, who will bring to light the things now hidden in darkness, will disclose the purposes of the heart, then every man will receive his commendation from God. Right. So I just wanted to make those points and clarify those points. And did you have anything to add to that, Aria?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's pretty clear that, I mean, obviously Christianity and Islam accept the Torah as a divine book. Now, they might have different positions in terms of whether the Torah that the people have in their hands currently is the original one. Sure. So there might be that type of difference. And we know from at least from the Gospels, that Jesus came to complete the law and fulfill the law. And, he's obviously quoting from the Torah. There's many examples where he, pulls out the scroll of Isaiah and says that this is who I am. So obviously, the Torah is the foundation for both Christianity and Islam. And I think when we talk about these different degrees of revelation, we're not necessarily creating a hierarchy amongst the prophets, or even talking about the quality. We're talking about the modality, really, and what we can decipher from that. And there's a lot of reasons, I think, that we can get into in terms of why the modality with Israel was national, whereas the modality with Jesus and Muhammad was personal. It probably is connected to the political context of the time. the capacity of the audience. And obviously, these are two chapters in a story that is to be continued and be concluded with either a second coming or the advent of a Mahdi, or clearly
Mashiach.
or the Mashiach, exactly. And so there's still something that is left to be completed, and so the subject remains open-ended, and that's probably by design, why it is open-ended, so that we can have more agency in this process as human beings and exercise our free will.
Right. Yes, and so in Surah 5, Ayah 48, there, right, this issue of disagreement, right, among the various religious communities, right, so it's also involving Judaism, right, so it's involving the disagreements between Jews, Christians, and what the Muslims, or this newly emerging community of Islam, right, because they all have disagreements on them among themselves, right? So Judaism does not accept Christianity or Islam, and Christianity does not accept Islam, but Christianity and Islam both accept the Torah. Let's put it that way. Now, of course, there are different, as you said, there are different views that both Christianity and Islam have about the state of the Torah now, right? But as far as the divine origins of the revelation, right, since it was public, right, there's no debate about that, right? And and in any case, so I hope that helps us avoid any misunderstandings. Now, we did mention last week when we were looking at a passage we'll look at again today, Surah 42, where it gives the different modes of wahi. You had mentioned that it seems to be laying these out hierarchically. So we have a kalam, and then we have a wahi in the form of hearing from behind the veil, that is the veil of God, and wahi, which is received from an angel, right? A messenger, that is an angel. Right. And so even I would point out, and I think you're correct, right, that there is a hierarchy there. But I would say that even though that is correct, that still we can say that even the lowest mode of revelation, which would be through an angel, is mind-bogglingly exalted, right? It's still divine revelation. Right, so there's no pejorative valence, right, implied by me, especially not by that verse, by pointing out the different levels, right? So even the lowest form of revelation is exalted beyond the normal human comprehension. So so it's more than we could probably put it this way, that that ayat is speaking comparatively, and it's not delivering a value judgment, maybe is one way, right, of expressing it.